The book of Hebrews is one of the most important books of the New Testament. One interesting thing about this epistle is that it's anonymous. Based on the book's contents, we know that the author was well versed in formal rhetoric and that he possessed a thorough knowledge of the Jewish scriptures. Now, some people think the Apostle Paul wrote Hebrews because he had the necessary knowledge of the Old Testament, and some of the topics in Hebrews parallel Paul's other letters. However, if Paul wrote Hebrews, it seems strange that none of his other letters allude to Jesus as high priest, since Hebrews is centered on this theme. Also, the author of Hebrews distinguished himself from those who heard Jesus directly. It's unlikely that Paul would do this, since he typically grouped himself with other apostles. Besides Paul, some think Hebrews was written by Apollos, or Barnabas, or maybe Clement of Alexandria. But the bottom line is, we don't know, because the author of Hebrews never identifies himself. We also don't know the people to whom it was originally written. Tertullian described the book as an epistle for the Hebrews before the end of the 2nd century, but the book itself never names its intended audience. However, we can assume the original readers were mostly Jewish Christians, since the book deals heavily with Christ's relationship to the Old Covenant. Hebrews begins by establishing the ultimate superiority of Jesus. It says he's superior to the prophets because he is the radiance of God's glory. In other words, if people want to know who God is, there is no higher revelation than Jesus. Additionally, Hebrews teaches that Jesus is superior to the angels, to the point where the angels will worship him. And the reason Jesus receives this worship is because he is God. Hebrews 1:10 makes this clear by describing Jesus with the words of Psalm 102, which was originally addressed to Yahweh. It would be blasphemous for the author of Hebrews to give Jesus the same description as God, unless, of course, Jesus is God. So, having established the deity of Christ, the author goes on to emphasize the humanity of Christ. He says Jesus was made lower than the angels so that he might taste death for everyone. And since Jesus experienced the limitations of being human, he's able to understand the temptations of his people and help them overcome their struggles. Hebrews 4:15 calls Jesus our high priest, who can sympathize with our weaknesses. Now, the term high priest was very meaningful to Jews under the Old Covenant. Ancient Israel had many priests who would offer sacrifices for sins, and the high priest would annually enter the most holy place to offer the blood of a sacrifice for all Israel. This is where the book of Hebrews tackles a vital question. How does the atonement of Jesus relate to the animal sacrifices required by the Old Covenant? The book answers this question by highlighting the insufficiency of the ancient sacrificial system. First of all, the Israelite priests were sinners, which meant they had to offer sacrifices for their own sins as well as for those of the people. Secondly, because each high priest eventually died, they couldn't permanently intercede for the people. Furthermore, they had to offer sacrifices over and over again because the slain animals only provided a temporary covering for sin. They did not cleanse the conscience. They were not a permanent solution. But Jesus is shown to be a superior high priest and a superior sacrifice. Unlike Israel's high priest, Jesus has no sin. He continues forever, and he paid for the world's sins by offering only one sacrifice, the sacrifice of himself. Another noteworthy difference is that Jesus was not descended from the line of Aaron. Instead, he belongs to a priesthood known as the order of Melchizedek. Now, the Bible reveals very little about Melchizedek. He's mentioned in Genesis as the king of Salem, which would later become Jerusalem, and priest of God Most High. The text records Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation, paying tithes to Melchizedek. So, the author of Hebrews argues that Melchizedek's priesthood is greater than the Levitical priesthood because it existed first and continues forever. Even the Old Testament predicted that the Messiah would be a priest not of the line of Aaron, but in the order of Melchizedek. It also predicted a new covenant where God's law would be written not on stone tablets, but on the hearts of the people. So, The author concludes that the Old Covenant was never intended to permanently resolve the problem of sin. Instead, the animal sacrifices served as a foreshadowing of Jesus. He is the fulfillment of the law and the only way for humanity to be reconciled to God. Next, the author urges his readers to stand firm in their faith, even in the face of persecution. He reminds them that God has promised to return and reward those who diligently seek him. He then lists well-known figures from the Old Testament who were commended for their faith, saying we should look to them as our examples. Above all, we should fix our eyes on Jesus, who endured the shame of the cross for the joy set before him. The closing section of the book also contains a warning for unbelievers. They are responsible to trust in Jesus to escape God's righteous wrath. As a whole, the book of Hebrews is centered on the identity of Jesus Christ. It highlights his fulfillment of the Old Covenant and his establishment of the New.